Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Fretz, and I am the Program Coordinator at the Parish Resource Center. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, Transitioning to Normalcy HR Concerns, which is part of our ongoing series of webinars to address a variety of issues that churches and nonprofits are facing as a result of the pandemic. This morning, we are grateful to have Jeff Worley and Ian Brinkman with us from Gible, Crabill, and Hess, and they will be sharing with us shortly. In case you would like to know more about some of the other workshops and webinars that we have coming up, please feel free to visit parishresourcecenter.org and click on our events and workshops link. Today we are recording this webinar, and we will make a video of it available to you afterwards. Jeff and Ian will be sharing some content with us, and then we will have a time for question and answers. We will have two ways in which you can submit questions during that time. And so I will bring up the screen again to walk us through that. So if you would like to simply chat your question to me, and then I can read off your question during that time, you are welcome to click on the chat button that is at the bottom of your screen there. And then after you have done that, make sure that you have addressed it to me as the host of the meeting. And then you can type your message in and hit enter, and I will receive it and we'll read that out loud for Jeff and Ian. If you would prefer to say your question out loud, you can use the raise hand feature of Zoom. So you would then click on the participants button that you see at the bottom of your screen, and then click on raise hand in the bottom right corner. And then I will see that your hand is raised and can unmute you, and you can speak your question out loud. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Jeff and Ian, please take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So I live, Ian doesn't live with me, but I live with my wife and my two kids on a farm, and this is a great place to quarantine. My 14-year-old daughter, she rescues kittens. Farm cats have a lot of kittens, and she's in the process of rescuing these kittens, and she gets them litter trained, and then she adopts them out. And last night over dinner, I was telling them about the webinar today, and my daughter commented, Dad, wouldn't it be so much cooler if you talked about something interesting like cats? So I'm not sure whether you're a cat person or a dog person or maybe a fish person, but according to the opinion of my teenage daughter, this webinar is not going to be as interesting as the aforementioned topics. But thanks for joining us anyway. I'm not as cute as a kitten. Ian's not going to chase his tail like a dog, but we hope to present you with some valuable information today. Jeff Worley is my name, and I'm a partner at Gible, Crabill, and Hess, and Ian is an attorney as well here at Gible, Crabill, and Hess. We practice in the corporate practice group area, work with nonprofits on a variety of issues as well. And, we're in this COVID pandemic now. We're starting to see the process of reopening. And so today, what we really wanted to focus on was, what are the considerations for businesses opening up. Is my video looking okay?
You're a black screen right now, Jeff, for me, and you're freezing. But others seem to see you fine, so I think everybody's having different technological issues right now.
Okay. Ian just messaged me, and I was like, okay. One of the joys of COVID and Zoom calls. Each situation is going to be different when it comes to your particular institution, your particular organization. There's underlying circumstances involved. So please, consult with your legal counsel on these matters. We're going to present big picture ideas here today, and we're going to open up for question and answer. But as my malpractice carrier makes sure I note, this does not constitute legal advice. So again, consult with your legal counsel as you address, your specific issues. And as I mentioned, each situation is different. We have a number of churches joining us today, a number of faith-based organizations. And those organizations are faced with unique issues as well. Some of you are in our nonprofit world, I understand, and so different than churches. And so, there's different considerations to keep in mind. For churches, some of the implication for you is that Governor Wolf's stay-at-home orders may not apply to you. And Ian's going to get into more of that in detail. Quick constitutional primer. We have the First Amendment that separates church from state, and that limits what state can regulate as far as churches go. We could spend all afternoon talking about that, and we're not going to do that today, but there may be some of the regulations that may not apply to you as a church. However, we're also going to get into why you might want to consider, following these guidelines as well, because there are also liability concerns, and the church, just like any other place of public accommodation, bringing people in, does have liability concerns. And so while the state may not be able to regulate the church in certain instances, that does not mean that a church is immune from lawsuits for negligence or other matters of that. So again, we're going to kind of get into that. And then we're going to get into some of the employment considerations and just general concepts that you might want to consider as you are looking to reopen your organization, your sanctuary, your business. So Ian, why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thank you for Parish Resources putting this on for us. Again, my name's Ian Brinkman. I'm an attorney here at Gible, Crabill, and Hess. I work in the employment law and corporate practice group, so I work closely with nonprofits and religious institutions on a regular basis. I've also been working closely with Jeff on all things COVID-19. I've written a lot of the resources on our website, including the resources that Jeff and I drafted that we gave out before this presentation. Those two resources would be good to follow along with, and then also use later to help you formulate plans and put those plans into place. So I'm going to expand on a little bit about what Jeff just mentioned. First, we need to understand where religious institutions and churches fall in the scheme of the stay-at-home and health and safety orders put out by the state. As Jeff alluded to, you have, everyone's probably familiar with the stay-at-home orders and health and safety orders. And then you had businesses that were exempt because they were essential or life-sustaining businesses. And then beneath that, there were businesses that could seek waivers from the requirements. Religious institutions are above that whole scheme. The stay-at-home orders and health and safety orders do not apply to religious institutions. So this would be for churches and other houses of worship and the religious activities that occur there. They completely do not apply. And I would say that religious institutions that deal purely in religious activities, that blanket statement carries through, that none of the stay-at-home and health and safety orders apply to those types of activities. Now, there are other activities that churches and religious institutions participate in that could change that analysis. There's what I'm calling a gray area. So this is where a religious institution does activities that involve social outreach to the public. Either the public comes to the institution, or the institution goes out to the public. And these would be roles that nonprofits might perform, or any type of nonprofit would perform, not just a religious institution. When the public is involved, this is beyond your congregants, then you're in an area where the stay-at-home order and the health and safety orders may apply. This is because you're interacting with the public in different ways, the gatherings are larger, and you have less control over what's going on, and it's not directly, purely a religious activity. So this is a gray area where those type of social outreach public efforts likely fall under the health and safety orders and stay-at-home orders. And then there's a third category that we've identified, and this is the category of activities that a religious institution might be involved in that's completely and independently regulated by a federal or state agency or regulator. So we're thinking about food production, healthcare, schooling, and childcare. If the church, if the religious institution is involved in any of these, and they're certified, regulated, or controlled by a state or federal entity, then they must follow that state or federal entity's regulations. So say a preschool or an elementary school run by a religious institution is also certified by the state, which can be the case. Then you're already following state guidelines before the pandemic occurred. So it makes sense that if the guidelines were updated in response to the pandemic, that you would also need to follow those state guidelines. So again, just to review very quickly, religious institutions that are participating in purely religious activities are above and are not, above the stay-at-home and health and safety orders, and the stay-at-home and health and safety orders do not apply to them. If you're doing social outreach as a religious institution, something that a general nonprofit might do, or inviting the public into your facilities beyond your regular congregants, then you're in a gray area where the stay-at-home and health and safety orders likely apply. And then we have the independent regulations, where if you have a school or you're producing food or you're providing healthcare services or other similar type of services, then you really need to look to that independent regulatory body for your special requirements based on those types of activities. One way that you can determine which type of activity falls in which category is by looking up your NAICS code. This is a code that you can find on your OSHA filings, your tax filings, or your insurance paperwork. And it's a code that those types of businesses use to classify other businesses. Most religious churches and most religious institutions are only going to have one code, and that code is for religious institutions. But if you have more than one code, it can help you determine which activity falls into the pure religious activity, the gray area activity, or the independent regulated activity. This is an important determination. Our resources, both the ones that we've handed out and the ones on the GKH website, will help you make this determination, but it's certainly something that Jeff and I are capable in advising you on a case-by-case basis. So don't be afraid to reach out to us and inquire depending on your situation. So now that we know the categories of regulations and which types of activities must follow the stay-at-home and health and safety orders, it's important to also explain that oftentimes courts and the law uses ordinances, orders, regulations, and statutes to set a standard of care which is reasonable in the community. So even though a religious institution by law does not have to follow these health and safety orders, a court might look at a religious institution's activity and decide whether they were negligent or not negligent based upon what the standard in the community was. And right now, the standard in the community is these health and safety orders. So again, while you will not, a religious institution participating in purely religious activities will not be cited or fined for not following a health and safety order. However, if a congregant gets sick and files a lawsuit in court, they could point to the health and safety order as being what is a reasonable response to COVID-19. And if the religious institution fell below that response, the court could use that bar to determine whether they were negligent or not. So again, it's not a requirement. It is not a legal requirement but is something that we think is very prudent because of civil liability purposes, that religious institutions follow these health and safety orders. So somewhat incident to that, and while you're digesting this information and formulating your plans, you should also reach out to your insurance company to understand where the bounds of your coverage are and how the gaps in your coverage inform the plans that you make and where you put your resources for preparing for opening back up to the public. Your insurance company may also be able to give you advice and examples of where claims might be outside or inside of coverage. And they also might give you pointers as to what types of measures you could take generally, and then also what types of measures the insurance company itself would like to see and would look more favorably on a claim if a religious institution took these different steps before a person was exposed. And if you take those steps, the insurance company might find them reasonable and approve your claim. But since we're outside of this idea of legal, criminal fines and penalty enforcement, and inside the area of reasonableness, civil liability, general health and safety, it's going to be about implementing a plan, but also doing it in a holistic sense. It's not just a sheet of paper with rules on it that everyone must follow, but it's looking at your insurance forms and all your different resources that way to come up with a full broad response to reopening to the pandemic.
And Ian,
so now,
one thing that's important, I think, for folks to remember is your insurance policy will have exclusions in it. And some insurance policies specifically even exclude contagious diseases and things of that nature. So, you really do need to focus on your policy before you open up and before you start bringing your congregants in or opening your business or operations back up to make sure that there is coverage there.
Yes, and insurance companies also have riders to fill in those gaps, or you can focus other resources on those areas where there's not a fallback for insurance coverage. So that's a good point, Jeff. So now that we know, where religious institutions fall generally in the scheme of health and safety orders, and now we know why it's recommended that even if they don't have to follow the health and safety orders, that it's prudent that they do. I'm going to briefly explain what the details of the health and safety orders. Again, the resources that we handed out are the more exhaustive version of this explanation. There are, as you can see, several pages of requirements. So I'm just going to highlight each category very briefly so we can get to your questions. From the outset, I will also say that religious institutions that are doing purely religious activities that know they are not bound by the health and safety orders, but would like to follow them to avoid civil liability and to uphold good health and safety practices, you have two options. First, you can follow the state's health and safety guidelines. In my opinion, that is the easiest way to go because it's the most fully fleshed out policy where you need to think of it in circumstances that are particular to you, but it already has in place what you do after you decide what those circumstances are. But again, because there are not laws that you must follow, you can also look to the Center for Disease Control guidelines, the CDC guidelines, and follow those. So if you prefer those, or if they speak more directly to the type of activities that you're performing, they are equally as likely to put you within a reasonable standard of care as the state's health and safety orders are. I will also say
health and safety orders do follow a lot of the CDC guidelines as well.
Yes, I was just going to say that. I do also prefer the state's health and safety orders because they integrate and build on the CDC guidelines. So in some respects, they are more comprehensive because it goes off of what Pennsylvania state-specific problems are going on as far as the pandemic is concerned, and then it uses the really good CDC resources to inform further the state's own guidelines. So either will work. I think the state's is better as a more comprehensive, ready-made guideline, and both in tandem, read together, will get you exactly where you need to be. And it's important, and Jeff has pointed this out, is use common sense when reading this. Sometimes it really seems like it's an onerous requirement, and then you read all the resources, you read the frequently asked questions, and it's more amenable to a nonprofit or religious institution setting than it may first appear when you read it in its plain and simplest terms. If after that it seems like something that's beyond the pale or beyond reason, reach out to Jeff or I, and we can try to explain the nuances in ways to make it a reasonable response in both from the institution's resources and for their goals for health and safety.
And
Okay,
while
so
we're focusing on the legal component to this, of course, when you step back, the big the hope is we keep people safe. We're keeping your congregants safe. We're keeping your folks you're serving safe and well. And so not to put too fine a point on, but I mean we're here to talk about legal liability and things. But at the end of the day, obviously the big picture is how do we keep people safe? And our feeling is look to what the CDC and the state are saying.
Yes, and that's, Jeff reminds me of my third reason why I think in general it's important to use these standards as the reasonableness standard, is because it is developed by healthcare professionals whose job and aim it is to keep everyone healthy and safe. So you could go out and try to cobble together your own policy, and it could stand up against any challenge in court. But this one is vetted by, healthcare professionals, people with advanced degrees and whose jobs are to make these policies. So then your job would merely be to implement the policy in an effective and sensible way within your congregation or your facilities or your institution. So that's another great point by Jeff, that these, it's not the end all be all. You can certainly try to make your own, but it's something that's for many reasons very, very suited for these circumstances. So now I'm going to go through what these health and safety orders say. Again, this is the 10,000, 100,000 foot view. There are dozens and dozens of requirements in each of these categories. I'm just going to hit the highlights. And the perspective that I am taking, I am hitting the highlights from the state's health and safety order. But remember, a lot of these highlights are just going to be duplicated in the CDC guidelines because they are one and the same. So the first broad category is cleaning. So important to keep in mind is keep your regular cleaning practices standard, in place, and filled with resources. So this is not a time to neglect what you normally do to implement these special rules. All the procedures that you had before kept your facilities clean and everyone healthy and safe, and those are still important. And then we just need to add on that at least once a day, if not more than once a day, you need to wipe down, both clean and disinfect high-touch areas. That's going to be the most important parts of cleaning. Maintain your current practices and clean once a day at the very least high-touch areas. So another big category, and it's important to keep in mind that this is a special category, and this category only applies to if there's a probable or confirmed case in the facility or at the institution. So this is if an employee, a vendor, a volunteer were to visit and you later find out that they have symptoms of COVID-19 and they were around people that had COVID-19, or they just tested positive for COVID-19. So this is a very narrow set of requirements in that circumstance alone. And for churches and religious institutions, instead of adding customers to that list, you have to add your congregants to that list. So you would have a much wider array and much larger number of people where this would potentially apply to. So again, this is if someone has been to the facility that is a probable or confirmed case of COVID-19. First and foremost, you have to have a plan together. Our resources that we gave to you have a great plan for how to respond. And it's just a matter of fleshing that out and how it will interact with your specific circumstances. And essentially that plan is comprised of two things. First, you need to isolate everyone from the area where that person who was a probable or confirmed case was. This just doesn't mean the vestibule or the entry area or the pew that they're sitting in, but it can mean anywhere that they were. Did they go to make coffee in the kitchen? Did they go to visit a loved one at a lesson or in a childcare setting? So not just the obvious places, but really where this person was in the institution. Close off all of those areas and wait as long as you can to clean them, at least 24 hours, because the virus kind of dies down on its own. So wait to clean it as much as you can. The second thing is to remove the person that is known to be the infected or confirmed case. And then if you know people were near them, both proximally and then for a length of time, you also have to ask those people to leave and to not come back.
This is more, I mean, you can think of this more in terms of the employment context. I mean, where you have an employee who comes in, tests positive, you're going to tell that employee you need to go home, and anybody that employee's had contact with is going to need to also go home and quarantine. Again, these, as we mentioned at the beginning, each situation is going to be unique and different. And certainly for churches, it's a little bit of a different circumstance than in the employment context. But
yes. And so after removal of the actual infected person and the people that were in close contact with them, then it's monitoring. In the employment context, this can be direct monitoring, where you ask them to take their temperature, ask them to report symptoms, and you have a dialogue, a back and forth. And that would be in the employee, volunteer, and religious leader context. You should be monitoring them on a daily basis to make sure what their symptoms are and following the very detailed CDC guidelines and the handouts for depending on what type of exposure they had, what type of monitoring is required, and when they can come back to the facility. Now for congregants, it might be a little more difficult, and it's probably advisable to be a little more hands-off. So this would be more of a circumstance where you inform the congregant who has become ill that they must isolate. You direct them to the type of isolation regime recommended by the CDC, and then both of you keep in mind that isolation regime and make sure that that person doesn't come back within that period. Now, when they do come back, it's unlikely that you're going to be requiring them to take their temperature and requiring them to report their symptoms. And it's more likely that you would just ask, did you follow the CDC guidelines that we agreed that you would follow? And, has it been 14 days? Generally, have you recovered? Jeff, would you say that's we shouldn't go as far as employees with congregants, I would say.
Right. And there's a big kind of bigger question that folks have been asking too. And Ian's going to get into a little bit more of, you're going to have to notify employees who've been in contact with the infected employee, but you're also going to have to maintain confidentiality because this is still a confidential, this is confidential information. This is regarding somebody's protected disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so it has different connotations in the employment context versus, again, in the church context. But in any situation, the employer or the church can, ask people who are coming in to take their temperature, ask if they've had any symptoms. So if you're running a nonprofit and you have employees who are coming in, you can say, look, we're going to do a temperature screening before anybody comes in the building, or we're going to ask everybody to do a temperature screen at home before they come into the building. Or at the very least, we're going to ask people, before they come into the building, have you had any symptoms? And we're going to do a daily check-in. And likewise, for the church, you may be, putting out something on your webpage or, before people enter, just a reminder, if you've had symptoms, please don't come. We still have a Zoom service for you. Please stay at home. If you are aware of somebody who's coming in and appears to be sick, in the employment context, you absolutely have the right to send them home. And the same way in the church context, if you were to have somebody who was disruptive in the church context during service, you would escort them out and tell them, you need to go home. As a church, you have those same rights that you do now. And so if you suspect that somebody's sick and you're not comfortable with them being at church, hey, I'm sorry, but you need to go home for the day and be in touch, and we'll see, what things look like next week.
Yeah, and as I think Jeff explained well there, the dividing line between employees and congregants is really on the monitoring side rather than the removal and identification side. If a congregant is exhibiting symptoms and they told you that they're exhibiting symptoms, or they've told you they tested positive, then you must ask them to leave the facilities. It's more when the steps for monitoring and when they can come back, that confidentiality and that more hand-holding approach versus personal responsibility approach is the dividing line between employees, volunteers, and then congregants. So those are the steps, again, that you need to take if there's a probable or confirmed case in the institution itself. A third category is just general employee distancing and health measures to take. Again, this is a common sense will take you a long way with these measures. So just think about the disease is transmitted by being close to people and touching things that infected people have touched. So what can we do to prevent those things from happening? So that means staggering and distance. So staggering when people can come into the facility, when they leave the facility, when they take breaks, what type of breaks they take, where they can take these breaks. And again, it's about the distance during these breaks. So it's not just, oh, well, we have 15-minute increments of when people can come inside. But if everybody's congregating outside and standing next to each other, that's not going to work. So it's also about having, when you stagger breaks, if it's 4 people instead of 10 people, still making sure those 4 people aren't sitting on top of each other. They're 6 feet apart. It's also about cleaning. So cleaning areas where individual employees sit often. It's about not sharing employee resources. So if there's 1 stapler and 3 employees, it might just be best to buy 2 other staplers and having designated resources for each employee. And then for bigger items like copiers or scanners or things that cannot be that have to be shared, you wipe them down and you give them resources where, after an employee has used it, that employee can wipe it down so it's clean for the next use. And the employee that comes and uses it next can wipe it down before their use so they can ensure it's clean. And then also similarly for cleaning hands, to having hand washing facilities readily available so at any time an employee or volunteer can wash their hands. I would say in the religious institution and nonprofit context, this is when you want to treat your employees similar to volunteers as far as the resources and staggering and distancing. Jeff will yell at me because we never treat volunteers or non-employees like employees, but in this one very, very narrow context, for the staggering, distancing, cleaning, and the hand washing, treat them as if they are employees. And for this last requirement as well, everyone must wear masks. If you're at work or on a volunteer site, you have to wear a mask. There are very narrow exceptions for health concerns. If you're 2 years old or younger, which I doubt you will have employees or volunteers that are 2 years or younger, and then those for safety reasons, such as their operating equipment that they need to be able to see, and the mask prevents them from seeing properly. But those are very narrow exceptions. And then also if you are completely isolated and alone and you will not come into contact with anyone. So running into the office to get some papers at 9 o'clock at night, nobody's going to be there, you don't have to wear a mask. But if you're in your office and everybody else is outside of your office and you shut the door, you don't have to wear your mask. But as soon as somebody comes in or as soon as you step out, you need to wear your mask. So if you would forget, it's probably just best to say, wear your mask at all times unless you're eating or taking a smoke break or something like that. So those are, again, are another category for the employee side of things, employee volunteers. A fourth category.
Again, you might want to also make that consideration though for congregants, and that's going to be a decision you're going to need to make as a church. Are you allowing people to come into for services without a mask? And
yes. So, and this next category kind of touches on that. So this next category is another special category that will likely apply to all of you, is if the organization is serving the public inside a defined space. So this would be your congregants. These would be the people that visit your church to use its services. These would be everyone but volunteers and employees. And essentially, these requirements, when you're serving the public in a defined space, say a church, for instance, this is like what I like to call your grocery store rules. So if anybody's been to a grocery store recently, they've seen all those types of things at grocery stores and those retail stores that are still allowed to be open. All those measures they are taking, this is that type of category. So some of the big highlights are that you can only have 50% occupancy based upon the occupancy certificate that you have. You want to think about special hours for your vulnerable population. And this is the time I'd like to make just a small plug that, we talked about the categorization of religious institutions, plans, how things are specific to your circumstances. And I also think this is a really important time to think about the people and the vulnerable populations that you serve and how the pandemic has changed all of that. How are your normal vulnerable populations affected by the pandemic? And then also, what has the pandemic done to make populations that normally thrive now vulnerable? And I think religious institutions and nonprofits are uniquely positioned to outreach and develop good plans to help these people during these abnormal times. So the vulnerable population hours in the grocery store context are having older people come in before everyone else can. But for religious institutions and nonprofits, this could be a whole host of things, of different ways of organizing your building, of different ways of organizing your services, so that the people that are most likely to be infected and most likely to be impacted by this pandemic are focused upon. Just real quick, if I may as well, is that the health and safety orders instruct that if you can't follow them, then you should not be providing the goods or services that you want to. Because the whole point is that if the health and safety orders keep people safe and healthy, if you can't follow them, then there's the likelihood that they can't be safe and healthy. For religious institutions and nonprofits, this may mean triaging certain services and then pushing those resources that cannot be used in services that can't be provided to other services, to new vulnerable populations. So where doors may be closed, others may be open. So you guys are really in a position to think about these problems in a unique way, pivot quickly, and get services to people in need. So sorry for that little social justice plug there for a second, but I think that's also very important when thinking about your vulnerable populations. It's not just the elderly, and you guys know who's vulnerable better than most. So just keep that in mind through this whole process. Also, serving the public has to wear masks. So just like your employees and volunteers must wear masks, your congregants must wear masks. The same exceptions would apply. This would be thinking about your younger persons, your persons with health conditions that cannot wear a mask, and the safety of persons. So maybe somebody walks with a walker or a cane, and the mask would obstruct their view, and a fall is a possibility, then they might not need to wear a mask. If the reason for not wearing a mask is a health reason, you're not really supposed to inquire as to the details of the health reason or any documentation for the health reason. They just must espouse that because of a health condition, a mask is not the safe thing for them to wear, and that's the end of the conversation. And then the other grocery store rules. So we're talking again about lines, people in lines being 6 feet apart, And then if you have multiple lines, those lines are also 6 feet apart. We're talking about, and this is where you need to start thinking about your unique circumstances. So in the grocery store example, we're talking about cash registers and cashiers. Well, there aren't any cash registers or cashiers normally at churches or religious institutions, but there's collection plates. There's the greeting line. There's communion. There's the meet and greet of your fellow worshipers at the beginning of the services. You need to think about all these times where, oh yeah, through the course of my day, I come in with the 6 feet of contact of 20 people. And how are you going to modify what you do so you can still offer these things to your congregants, but in a safe way? So again, very, very important to keep in mind the common sense of no touching, no sharing, and keeping distance between each other. But some churches have seven services already. So how are you going to cut your occupancy in half and still serve everyone? How, if your population of congregants is 50% retirees, how do you have special access for vulnerable populations when that's almost all of your congregants? So it's important to think about ways to continue to offer these services while maintaining these health and safety orders. So the last requirement, and this is going to be one that probably least applies to you, is that you may have heard of the yellow, green, and red phases. Again, because religious institutions generally don't need to follow these rules, you don't really need to pay attention to what phase you're in. You may need to pay attention to what phase you're in if you're in the gray area, which we discussed, or the independent regulation. But for just pure religious institution activities, phases do not matter. However, the yellow phase requires places that are open to designate a pandemic safety officer. Again, all this information is in the resources that we provided. To print out a poster that designates that person and explains to both your version of customers would be congregants, volunteers, and employees that you are affirming that you understand the health and safety orders, that you have a plan to follow them, and that your pandemic safety officer is the person that you talk to if you have any questions or problems with the health and safety order. Particularly for institutions that are only going to follow CDC guidelines, do not use this pandemic safety officer form. Make your own form that mirrors this, but instead of saying, I promise I'm going to follow the state regulations, say, I promise I'm going to follow the CDC regulations. That'll be important because you're signing this piece of paper and affirming to everyone that you have a plan and you're following it. So you want to affirm that you are following the plan that you actually have in place. So that one is going to be the least important. But again, it's important to communicate all the plans and all the procedures that you're having in place to your employees, to your congregants. The best way to make sure that they follow the guidelines is to keep them informed early and often, and maybe even involve them to the extent that that's practicable in the process of coming up with these plans. Would people prefer to come in at a 7 o'clock service or a 1 p.m. service? These are things when the people that are supposed to follow the plans are involved with creating them, they're much more likely to follow them. In addition to the yellow phase requirements, another overarching theme is that if you can work from home, work from home. So I know a lot of all businesses and all social services involve person-to-person contact, and that's really important sometimes. But to the extent that it's not important or it can be done, just like we're doing here right now, do your work from home, do your meetings remotely, and work on, non-necessities are still non-necessities. If the visitor doesn't need to come into the facility, they shouldn't come into the facility. If services don't need to be provided, put your resources elsewhere. And then, again, just to reiterate, to know the limits of your ability to uphold these health and safety orders, use common sense, and if you follow what we've laid out in our resources, you'll be well on your way to compliance and protecting the health and safety of your employees and your congregants.
So Before we get into questions from you guys, I did want to just briefly touch on some employment matters as well, just for your consideration. Again, the resources are going to provide for, this in much more detail, but, one of the big questions we're getting, and this is, we have employees, they've been laid off. We want to bring them back, but they're making more on unemployment comp than they were when they were working for us. We know that nonprofits don't always have the opportunity to pay their employees at top dollar. They're now getting an additional $600 in stimulus. If they're saying, I don't want to return to work, I'm making more money on unemployment comp, I'd rather not. What do you do? And the short answer is you can force an employee at this time. Once you're back open and operational, it's time to come back to work. And you can require an employee to do so. And if an employee refuses to do so, you can report that employee to unemployment compensation for failure to accept suitable work. And they'll lose their eligibility for unemployment comp. Not necessarily the path that you want to go down, but at some point in time, if you have an employee who's refusing to return to work, that's an option. One of the things I will say with your employees is communication is going to be key here. So you want to understand if an employee is saying, I don't want to return to work, why don't you want to return to work? Do you have an underlying health condition? Well, okay, if you have an underlying health condition, then we might need to consider an accommodation per the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that involves, again, engaging in an interactive conversation with that employee to determine what do you need? What's a reasonable accommodation that we can provide for you? Understanding whether that person has childcare needs, because if they have childcare needs, they may be eligible for the extended FMLA per the Families First Act, and that's explained in pretty significant detail in the handout as well. So I'm not going to get into a lot of that. I'm sure probably most of you are familiar with that. If you're not, please ask questions about that. Don't forget about your other requirements. Just generally, if you have more than 50 employees, your FMLA requirements generally, you want to keep that in mind, as well as your ADA accommodation requirements as well. When we're looking at employees who are working from home, wage and hour considerations are a big deal. So making sure that your hourly employees are accurately recording all of their time, and that they're submitting it for you so that you have record of this, so that you ensure that they get paid for the hours worked, but also in case there would be a wage and hour audit or some dispute at some point, you have the information now to say, Tom worked 4.5 hours on Monday, 3.7 hours on Tuesday. If you are looking at any type of salary reductions for your staff, because I know this is going to hit some of you folks hard, the pandemic and what looks like to be some economic hard times in front of us. And some of you may be thinking about reducing salaries. You can do so. You have to do it prospectively, so you can't retroactively reduce somebody's salary. But prospectively, you can do so. It shouldn't be a temporary measure. It should be something that's going to be in place for a period of time. The Department of Labor doesn't like to see when a employee jumps back and forth between hourly and salaried, or their salary changes significantly from week to week, because then you're treating that employee more like an hourly employee. The risk you run is losing the exemption. Again, I think that communication is going to be key with your employees, and so if you're needing to make those reductions, you're letting them know what you're thinking of, letting them know why this is important, that you're doing this at this point, making sure that if you are reducing salary, that they are still meeting the salary basis, so that $684 a week test, they need to meet that threshold. And if you're moving somebody to a new job, reducing duties, you might want to revise their job description as well. So just some things to keep in mind as you're moving through that process. I think I'm going to sort of end our presentation at this point. We could go on and on about PPP loans and things of that nature. I did want to mention one thing about the PPP loans. I don't know if any of you have received a PPP loan, but Treasury just came out with some guidance, excuse me, that said for loans that are less than $2 million, there's going to be an assumption by Treasury that the organization needed the loan. And so there was a lot of confusion when the PPP loan came out about forgiveness and whether organizations might be held liable for taking a PPP loan. And we saw, the Los Angeles Lakers of all, getting a PPP loan. Harvard University got a PPP loan. They've all returned those under the scrutiny. And Treasury has just come out and said, look, our assumption is if the loan is less than $2 million, that organization did not have the capital to function without the PPP loan. That doesn't guarantee forgiveness of the PPP loan, but it does mean you're not going to get an audit and face some sort of criminal liability in the event that you have a PPP loan. When you're looking at your PPP loan forgiveness, you're going to want to work with your financial advisors on that, because ultimately they're going to advise you as to how much of that loan can go toward payroll, which it has to be at least 75%, and how much of that can be used for other expenses such as utilities or rent. And so with that, I think we're going to just open it up for questions and see what you guys, what's on your mind.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ian. We do have some questions that have come in about congregants who may have COVID and issues of confidentiality. We had a question that came in that said, if the pastor becomes aware that a congregant does have COVID, is it better to designate someone else to be the point person for communicating about the need to be quarantined so that the pastor can maintain relationships of trust and confidentiality with congregants?
Well, I think this is going to come somewhat back to communication, because the congregant very well might want the pastor to know, might want to have some one-on-one opportunity to talk with the pastor as they're going through this. And so I think, part of that's going to be, if you do have a point person who is, sort of, you might want to, I think you want to have somebody designated to say, look, this is a person who you're going to contact should you, have symptoms, should you have questions about our protocols, should you have comments, etc. And likely that's not going to be the pastor, because the pastor's already busy enough. But then, I think with that, if that person reports, hey, I have symptoms, then I think it's going to be a discussion with that congregant as to, do you want us to let the pastor know? Do you want us to let the congregation know? Because I think a lot of folks would say, I want the whole congregation to know. I want these folks to be praying for me. But if they say, no, I prefer it to be confidential, fine. They can keep that confidentiality. On the employment side of it, it's a little bit different, because therein lies a requirement that the employer maintain confidentiality per the Americans with Disabilities Act. But that's a little bit of a distinction there.
I would also say, and this comes from the CDC guidelines that are in our resource, that the pastor can play a very important role in showing that the policy that's set by the church is important, is within the doctrinal teachings of whatever religious body or organization you're a part of, and that to promote a new culture within the church of most things are kept confidential, but for the good of the group, it's important that if you have symptoms, you stay home. It's important if you find out later that you had symptoms and you were at church, that you let us know. So a way that there are going to be circumstances where people will not want that information disseminated, and that's going to be a church by church, institution by institution decision as to how you deal with that. The guidelines will say you need to keep confidentiality, at the same time telling people that person was in contact with that they may have been in contact with the person exposed. You could see how one person wanting to maintain anonymity can, really make things difficult down the road if it spreads. But that, again, will be an individual, institution by institution policy. And then once you set that policy, it's important that you follow that policy. But pastors, I agree with Jeff's analysis, the pastor may not be the point person for communication purposes, but the pastor can play an important role with the new culture of the institution and how you deal with these types of issues.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, besides worker safety, what might be some issues related to the facility that we should consider? For example, are there HVAC airflow standards, Hepa filter considerations, and similar issues that could be a source of litigation?
Well, we're not HVAC certified, at least I'm not. I don't know about you, Ian. So I'm a little hesitant to kind of go into the details on that. I think that the CDC might have some guidance for you as to that, but
you could also, the health and safety orders, both from the state and the CDC, do not get that granular. Where you could look for that type of information might be OSHA. OSHA may be a great resource because COVID-19 is considered a type of illness where if you're infected and that infection can be traced to the workplace, you must report that someone became infected at the workplace. So because OSHA has this on their radar, there are likely resources on their website that gives technical standards to that extent. I will say the CDC does have technical standards for cleaning and disinfecting products, which is very helpful. And if you do a slightly deeper dive on the CDC or OSHA website, I wouldn't be surprised if there were further very technical specifications for different machines and filters and cleaning standards like that. But the health and safety orders don't get that granular. And if you're using commercially reasonable filters and things, I don't think COVID-19 has changed that. But again, OSHA might have further recommendations that you can take to take the next step to ensure a healthier workplace.
Thank you. Just a reminder that if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to chat those to me or use the raise hand feature of Zoom, and we are happy to keep answering questions as they come in. Another question that has come in is, what would a church's or my personal liability be for visiting with members in their homes, nursing care facilities, or the hospital?
Well, the liability concerns, are going to depend on the circumstances. And again, if you're visiting in the nursing home facility, that's going to be dependent on whether the nursing home facility is allowing you to entrance. And if the nursing home facility or the hospital is allowing you to enter into their premises, and I know a lot of those are fairly locked down, you'll need to follow their protocol. And as long as you're following their protocol, you should be okay. If you're going into people's homes, that is a concern. And again, to the extent possible, that you can practice social distancing. And that may mean I'm going to meet you on your patio instead of, in your house, or I'm going to drive up in your driveway and I'll stay in my car and speak with you. Because I know that, for a lot of folks, they're really missing that interaction with their pastors or their leadership and looking for some kind of connection. But as long as you are following the protocols of the institution that you're in, you should be fine. And for, setting your own sort of, once we're in the yellow phase particularly, that limits the number of folks that can be in an area assembled. And so you would be, within the standard of care if you're visiting in somebody's home, as long as you are continuing to follow the guidelines, wearing a mask and not touching and things of that nature.
And I
Do you have
think
anything
that
else?
also, yeah, I think that really highlights the three tiers that we talked about of pure religious activities, the gray area, or the independent regulations. You could see how, say, a pastor, it could occupy the three roles depending on what they're doing. If they're going to give religious counsel in somebody's private home, it's unlikely that the state would have anything to say about that. And that is going to fall on what policy the religious institution adopted. And again, it's very important to know that once you've adopted a policy, you have to implement it as the policy is written. That doesn't mean that you can't change the policy, but you have to uphold the policy. So if the policy is when the pastor is advising his congregation that he stays 6 feet apart, well, that's going to apply in the church. It's going to apply at a private home because it's the pastor acting in his official role and doing religious advising. If the pastor is dropping off food bank food to a non-congregant after church, not in his official capacity, well, then you might be in that gray area where somebody might have something to say about it if you didn't stay 6 feet apart, if you didn't just drop off the food and leave. So it is very, like Jeff said, and I think it's very important to highlight, it's case by case, role by role. Specific circumstances are going to drive liability. Everybody can act in their official capacity. People can also act in their individual capacity. That's going to dictate a lot of things. So whether you're dealing with a congregant or whether you're dealing with a purely public person is also going to change things. So it's really going to be a very sensitive case-by-case basis. This is why it's important to implement the policies before opening, before testing these different circumstances out, and then further refining policies as you come into contact with new activities, new things that challenge the policy that you already have in place.
Thank you. Another question that came in is about figuring out liability issues regarding churches that have typically rented outside groups, have rented their building to outside groups in the past, and how to navigate when and how to begin renting to outside groups again while limiting liability.
I think a brief answer to that is, following the state guidelines for that. I think because you're now opening the building up to other organizations, and that's going to kind of maybe fall more into that gray area that Ian was referencing.
Yes.
And the church may be acting more like a landlord and so for those situations, our recommendation would come back to look to what zone we're in at the moment and what's allowable under state guidelines.
Yeah, just some more detail on that. Jeff, I would agree with Jeff, and that you should not be renting or allowing businesses to operate that should not be operating in the zones that they are in. But once that threshold is met, as a landlord, you have significantly less requirements for your tenant. So once the tenant takes possession of the property, outside of common areas, all the things that we've discussed today are now the tenant's responsibility. And that's borne out in the health and safety orders. And there's something called a facility or a building health and safety order. And that kind of just reiterates the high touch, the cleaning type things, the reporting type things, but it only applies to common areas or areas in which the landlord has taken on the duty to clean or to monitor or to protect for the tenant. So after you get past who can operate and how they can operate, and once rentals are allowed in a yellow or green phase, when a church starts acting as a landlord, you're more of a realtor and in that gray area. So again, you want to make sure your zone allows the rental and viewing of rental spaces. But after that, your responsibilities are reduced significantly because the health and safety orders are taken from an organization by organization or employer by employer basis. So again,
one thing as well is if you're talking about renting for weddings, or you have another church that rents your facility, again, looking to what the state provides. If we're not in the yellow zone and somebody comes to you and says, we want to rent the church for a wedding, I don't think that that's recommended at this point. If you have other churches who are using your space and renting from you, so you have a smaller, the European congregation or what have you that rents your space on Wednesdays to have church, that may follow just exactly the same protocol that you have in place currently. So if they are following the same protocol that you're following, that would be okay.
A follow-up question we received is, how does the renter relationship apply to smaller support groups meeting periodically?
So I think that's sort of what I was kind of getting at. I hope that's kind of answers that question a little bit. Is if you have smaller groups, maybe it's AA or whatever it may be that's renting your basement. Again, with that, you'd want to look to what are the state guidelines and what is the state now saying about having in-person AA meetings, or so that's going to be a little bit of a case dependent, but certainly for some of those activities, that's not allowed at this point, and we wouldn't recommend that you take that step of opening up your facilities for, say, an AA meeting at this point.
Can you discuss how the rules apply to the use of the church as a polling place for elections?
So that's going to be another independent regulatory specific answer. So I know there's a lot out there on the Pennsylvania State website about polling places and modifying what they are, how they operate, depending on whether it's a church, a retirement home, or different places like that. So that is another good example on the 3 tiers of pure religious activity, the gray area, and independent regulation. Polling places would fall in that third independent regulation category. So you're going to want to look to the state resources on voter registration and voter activities. The name of the agency is escaping me right now, but our elections agency should have a lot of detail about that.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, this is a follow-up question on the issue of confidentiality. How do you handle contact tracing if an individual in your church develops COVID? Shouldn't it be important to let others who may have been in contact with that person aware of the situation? Confidentiality makes this a dangerous policy.
So that's a really good question and a good point for us to clarify something. Whether it's with your congregants or your employees, you're letting them know. So by way of example, when we're looking at the employment context where there's strict confidentiality, the employer has to maintain this strict confidentiality. That doesn't mean, and in fact, the employer's required to go to those employees that have had contact with the infected employee and let them know you've been in contact with an infected, somebody who's infected with COVID or suspected to have COVID. They're likely going to be able to, figure out who we're talking about, but you're not giving them a name. And so the same way with the congregants, you would, let them know. Again, it may be that congregant says, I want the church to know this, but it may be that they say, I don't want anybody to know that I have COVID. That's fine. We're not going to tell anybody. However, we still have an obligation to let people know that there was somebody at church, there was somebody that you might have had contact with who is testing positive now. So, but you're not giving out the name. Is essentially the rule of confidentiality.
Thanks. Another question came in that says, please comment on giving permission to not wear a mask. For example, a pastor visits a personal residence and the family gives permission for the pastor not to wear a mask.
So Again, this is going to highlight the distinction between, the health and safety orders do not apply to religious institutions, but to the extent the religious institution sets its own policy, you must follow that policy. Now, the policy could be that the pastor must wear a mask at all times, and if he's around the congregation or if he's in a public place, he must also wear the mask. But if a individual in an isolated area in a family home decides that the pastor may not wear a mask, that could also be part of the policy. And again, I think from the health and safety standpoint, that would be fine. You wouldn't hear anything from the state about that. From the civil liability side, you're also talking about theories like assumption of the risk or consent and things like that. But I would be very, very careful that is fully informed and free consent, that they don't feel like, well, if I don't let my pastor come in and not wear a mask, I'm not going to get the religious, advice and counseling that I need. It has to be fully and freely available. And then after that, just think about, there is a distinct possibility that one of the three people in that room not wearing a mask could be infected with COVID-19. And what happens if your pastor becomes infected or your pastor infects one of your congregants? So again, Jeff and I are here to talk about the civil liability and just general legal aspects of this. But you also have to just think about the health and safety of the individuals that are tasked with, supporting the institution, which are, your leaders and your flock, essentially. So there's a lot of different variables and facets you need to think about, and there's different layers. So make sure when you're going through these types of hypothetical thought exercises, you're thinking about each one of those layers. Yeah, the state's not going to find me, but what does this mean for the policy that we already have in place? And then what does this mean for the literal health and safety of everyone? So it's a complicated question with a complicated answer, unfortunately.
Thanks. Another question is, whose responsibility is it to identify those who may have been in contact with the potentially infected person? The potentially infected person may not remember all the places they have been.
Again, it will be case by case, and so you'll need to look at what's the circumstances. Are we talking about a church with 100 people who have been at a service and we know that one person was there? You may just simply be advising the congregation that there is somebody who's tested positive, who was at the service, the 10 a.m. Sunday service, and we're letting everybody know this because it's going to be hard for that person to recall exactly where they've been. In the employment context, it may be a little bit easier to determine that they were in the shipping area. That's where they generally worked, and they went to the bathroom, and so we know kind of the areas where they worked. But in terms of a congregation, it's likely that you're informing everybody who was at that service that there's been somebody who's tested positive or suspected to have COVID.
And again, when we're talking about the religious institutions and the inapplicability of the health and safety rules, it all falls back on what is reasonable. What would be a reasonable response if you found out that person was in contact with other people at the facility, and then based upon your policy that you're following, what is a reasonable response when you find that out? What's a reasonable implementation of contact tracing? Sometimes if it's a small congregation, like Jeff said, it's everybody that was there at 10 o'clock. If it's such a large congregation, the person doesn't go outside of sitting in the pew and going home, maybe it's a whole section. It could also be, hey, tell us what you remember now, and please, if you think of anything later, write to us, call us, let us know, and then be responsive when somebody's trying to communicate to you. Hey, I think I was here and I was infected, and I went to this, and this place. So yes, it's not reasonable to interrogate them or to think that they're going to, verbatim give you everything they need. But it would be reasonable to say, please follow up. Or, hey, let's have another conversation in 24 hours. Maybe your memory will have been jogged. So, you know, constant communication. Another one I don't think we've mentioned enough is just logging what you do, the information, keep a paper trail. This is very, very important in the PPP loan context, the expanded family medical leave, the expanded paid leave context, but just in general. How are you responding when your policy is called into action? Log what you do. So I think, you know, all these measures equal reasonableness. It's not just one thing. And that's why the common sense, hopefully, especially in new, strange areas such as we're in right now, will prevail. And, you know, when it comes down to it, did you take reasonable steps in response to an event? So that should also be very much the focus.
Thank you. We don't have any questions that have come in currently. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to chat those to us now or raise your hand.
I will, as we're waiting for any additional questions to come in, you know, feel free to reach out to us directly as well. We're happy to, you know, to engage with you further as needed. You can reach us through Chris. Our website is gkh.com, and we're happy to talk with you as needed. Anything else?
I was going to say,
Chris?
and if you are considering just strictly following the state's health and safety orders, we've done previous webinars for businesses that are recorded and have other resources out there that you can use. So if you're going to essentially act like a business, we have lots of good resources out there for those people as well.
Yeah, and that's on our website as well. So those are freely accessible to anybody. Any other questions?
No, no other questions have come in. And
Well,
I will just say, oh, go ahead.
Well, I'll let you wrap it up in just a second here then and close out. But I just wanted to, you know, thank everybody for being here today and sharing a little bit of time with us. We appreciate what you guys are doing, and stay safe and stay well, and we'll get through this.
Yes, we will.
Thank you both very much, Jeff, Ian. We really appreciate your time and expertise, and this has been a great opportunity to think through some of the legal issues and liability and make a plan for going forward. Thank you all very much for attending. Please feel free to visit parishresourcecenter.org to check out our upcoming webinars and events. And if you would like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at info@parishresourcecenter.org. Thank you once again, Jeff and Ian. Thank you all for coming. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
See you.